Now it's time to welcome our first speaker, Megan Considine, a master's student who is investigating the impacts of an invasive mud blister worm, a mud blister worm, sounds pretty gross, right? On commercial oyster farms in Oregon estuaries. She'll be talking about her background, growing up on the Chesapeake Bay, which is, I'm also from the Chesapeake Bay area, very fun. Her passion for oyster restoration, her current endeavors as a graduate student at Oregon State University. And so Megan, you may now go ahead and share your screen. I see your video is on, and you may begin your presentation.
All right. Good to go?
Looking good.
Okay, awesome. So hi, everyone. I am Megan Considine. I'm a graduate student at Oregon State University. And yeah, I'll be talking to you about my background as to why I love oysters. And I'll also be telling you about how I started in marine science and how I got to where I am today and what I'm currently studying here in Oregon, which is mud blister worms and Pacific oysters. So I grew up on the Chesapeake Bay in Virginia Beach, and this photo is of one of my favorite places in my hometown, which is First Landing State Park, which has one of the many waterways that lead to the Chesapeake Bay. And the Chesapeake Bay is known for its oyster restoration programs, where the goal is to increase the number of native oysters in the bay. And so you might be wondering, why would you want to restore them? Well, first, oyster populations in the bay are severely depleted. Oysters also act as ecosystem engineers, so they build off of one another, they attach to one another, and they end up creating these 3D reefs, which provide an array or a multitude of ecosystem services that are things that are really beneficial for humans and for different reasons. And so I'll get into some of those reasons. So oysters are filter feeders. So they slurp up water and filter out phytoplankton and particulate matter, which ends up cleaning the water and removing any excess nutrients. And so oysters in the Chesapeake Bay once could filter a volume of water equal to that of the entire bay within just 1 week. So that's about 19 trillion gallons, which is a lot of water to filter in just one day. But now the oysters are so depleted in that area that it takes them more than 1 year to filter that amount of water. So the physical structure of oyster reefs traps sediments, which stabilizes the shoreline, and the structure also prevents erosion because it acts as this natural breakwater structure that weakens wave energy. So it also protects us from storms and hurricanes. Oyster reefs also provide food and habitat and act as nursery grounds for marine organisms and commercially important fish species, so all of the types of fish that we like to eat. And their filtration services also increase light availability for vegetation in the water column, like the eelgrass that we see in the Pacific Northwest. And the wave weakening services also prevent erosion from marsh grasses or eelgrasses. Shells also provide nutrients for coastal forests like the redwoods in the Pacific Northwest. And oyster aquaculture and wild harvest provide food sources for us humans. And the oyster shell can be used as fertilizer for our gardens, building material, as well as jewelry and decoration. So growing up on the Chesapeake Bay, I was introduced to oyster restoration and the many ways in which oysters are important from a really young age, which inspired me to study marine science in college. And during my studies in school at the University of South Carolina, I continued to volunteer and intern with oyster restoration nonprofits in my hometown. And so in some of these photos, this photo on the left, you can see we're transplanting juvenile oysters onto a reef. And in that one trip, we transplanted about 10,000 oysters. And then the photos here on the right are some oyster castles that we built. So these oyster castles are built from cement and shell, and they can be stacked kind of like Legos. And they provide a hard substrate for oyster larvae or the tiny oysters that are swimming in the water column to attach to. So this is really important in areas where there's not a hard substrate, like muddy flat bottoms. So after finishing my degree in marine science, I moved to the Florida Keys to gain experience with coral restoration, working with a nonprofit there, Marine Laboratory. And similar to oysters, corals are also really important for the ecosystems that they live in. They provide a home for many different marine organisms, especially the commercially important fish species, again, the ones that we like to eat. And they also protect coastlines from storms and hurricanes because they weaken wave energy. And so working in Florida was a really great experience. We got to transplant corals like the ones you see over here on the left onto the reef by drilling holes into dead corals or rocks and then cementing the corals in, and we got to see them grow. And scuba diving in that clear blue water was incredible. I got to see marine organisms that I have never seen before, and it's kind of like a whole different world down there. So also when I was living in Florida, I got to do some really cool lobster experiments. So we would go out late at night during the new moon when the tide was coming in and cast nets over bridges to catch these tiny juvenile lobsters, which you can see a photo of them here, down here in the left corner. And this photo up here is of my friend David with his headlamp looking at what we caught in one of the nets. And we would catch a bunch of different zooplankton along with the lobsters, which was really fun to look at. And then we set up an outdoor tent, and we made a dark room in this outdoor tent because these lobsters are really light sensitive, and we got to test the behavior of these little guys. And so we spent many late nights collecting lobsters and studying their behavior and tinkering with all the gadgets that we created in the tent. And so after Florida, I returned back to Virginia to continue studying the organism that I love, oysters. But this time it was in a very high-tech experimental aquarium, which was quite the upgrade from the tent that we were using for the lobster experiments. And so here I worked at the Virginia Institute of Marine Science, studying how changes in the environment, like water temperature or salinity and pH, affect oyster development and growth. And so this system was really cool to work with because we were able to change all of those environmental conditions like the salinity, temperature, and pH, as well as gather all of the data that we were looking at through this computer system, which you can see some of the photos on the right there. So it was very high tech and cool to work with. So I feel like all of these experiences, as well as my love for oysters, has really helped lead me to where I am today, which is here in Oregon, studying at Oregon State University. And so I'm currently getting my master's in marine resource management. And as a graduate student, I'm studying mud blister worms in Pacific oysters. And so before I get into the details of what I'm studying, I wanted to see how many of you have eaten oysters. So Kate, if you could launch the poll, that would be great.
Hold on a second. I have to relaunch the poll.
No problem.
Can you see it now?
Yeah.
Okay. Looks like some of the responses are coming in. As soon as I have most people counted, I will end the poll and share the results.
Awesome. So it looks like a lot of you, 81%, have eaten oysters before.
I don't believe the percent.
That's not the, yeah, 17 people in the group have eaten oysters and 10 haven't. Okay. good to know. So, ooh. For those of you that have not eaten an oyster before, if you were to order them, they're often presented as what's termed by the half shell. So they look like this photo here where the meat is cupped in the left valve. But unfortunately, these pearly white oysters are starting to become infected with a pest that changes the appearance of their shell. So a clean oyster shell starts to initially become infected when the pest burrows into the shell. And then these burrows start to become blisters, which are bumps or blemishes inside the shell that fill with really smelly mud and feces and can sometimes become punctured when opening the oyster. So these blisters are not harmful to humans. And if they're punctured, the oyster can just be washed off and the meat is still okay to eat. But a lot of customers end up not buying the oysters anymore. So it's really hard to market for the oyster growers to market their product when they have an infection from this pest. And so it can be really harmful for some of the local oyster farms in the Pacific Northwest. And the small pest responsible for these infections is the critter shown here, which is known as the mud blister worm. Its scientific name is Polydora websteri. And so to help the oyster farms in this area, my research involves getting oyster samples from different locations along the Oregon coast to figure out where exactly is this pest currently. So I drive to different farms and bays to pick up oysters, or to pick up oysters from the farms, or to collect other native shellfish like clams and mussels myself. And so if I'm collecting native shellfish myself, then I go to the estuary myself, and I try to time the trip so that I arrive to the estuary at low tide. But sometimes that doesn't always work out. The last trip I took, I arrived a little late. So the water was a bit higher and the mud was a bit easier to get stuck in. And so long story short, I ended up falling in. So if you like to get a little money sometimes, then this is a good job for you. So after I get the oysters and clams or other shellfish, I usually take them to the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife lab to process them. But during this pandemic, it was really difficult to access the lab. So I ended up creating a lab in my home, in the comforts of my own home, which was really fun and also really smelly sometimes. You can see the photo up here in the left is the microscope that I got to set up. And then the photo down here in the middle is my kitchen table. And it shows all the tools that I need to open up the oysters and measure them and weigh them. And if I find any oysters with blisters or burrows or the blemishes, I record that information as well, and I extract the worms. And since they're so tiny, I often have to use a microscope to extract them. And so you can see these two photos up here to the right and in the middle are some good examples of some infected oysters. The one all the way in the right is very infected, and you can see a little worm crawling out of it there. And that's actually not Polydora websteri, it's a different worm. This photo down here, down in the right corner, that is Polydora websteri. And so that's a microscopic photo of it. And so once I get the worms, I usually preserve them and then send them off to another lab for DNA analysis. So I wanted to end with this cute comic. For those of you that do enjoy eating oysters and come across one of these blisters or blemishes, don't worry, your oyster is still safe to eat. Just wash it off if the blister ends up getting punctured. And try to think of it as imperfect produce, like an oddly shaped carrot that is still perfectly edible, and continue to support your local farms. And so with that, I'll leave it up to questions. And if you would like to contact me, my email's right there for you to get in touch.
Fantastic, Megan. Thank you very much for your presentation full of fantastic photos. And so I don't know how many of our viewers are excited to eat oysters or less excited to eat oysters after watching your presentation. But a couple of questions from our students, and of course, feel free to submit questions as we're going through right now. From Clifford, how do nutrients get from the oysters to the redwood forest? I believe this is referring to a part of your presentation from the beginning.
Okay, let me share my screen one more time so I can get to that photo.
Sure.
So there's a lot more than I was expecting. So the nutrients get to the redwood forest through like birds, like seagulls or any other organisms that just kind of carry the shells over to the forest, and they provide iodine nutrients that the forest often can't get without these ocean sources.
Very good. Thank you so much. We have a question from Joelle asking about, I'm going to combine both questions from this person. They're asking, do you eat oysters? So I think it's obligatory to ask if you eat them. And then also, how long have you been working with oysters?
So I personally do not eat oysters, which is always a question that I get. And people are always surprised when I say I don't. I'm actually vegetarian. And I've been working with oysters since when I was like 10 years old. I was getting to go on these oyster restoration field trips. So it's been quite a while, maybe like a 10, 12 years.
Very cool. And that's fair. You can study them, but you don't necessarily need to eat them, right?
Yeah.
We have a question from Amy and Sam. So back to this question, back to the redwoods and the nutrients getting to the redwoods. So how long does it take for the shell to break down in the forest? Do you have any idea or any estimate? Maybe a best guess. I know I'm putting you in the hot seat.
I really don't know. I mean, I would think it would take a long time. I'm not sure how quickly the nutrients kind of like leach out of the shell, if the shell needs to be broken up, or yeah, that's a great question. Honestly, I'm not entirely sure.
Okay, very good. So we have another question from Clifford. How do the mudworms create the blisters on the oysters? But I think it's a mud blister worm, correct?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So if you can explain a little bit more about that.
Yeah. So the mudworm creates the blisters. They excrete this type of liquid that ends up deteriorating the shell, and then they burrow into the outside of the shell. And then once they're inside of the shell, the oyster starts to grow shell around the worm to protect itself, kind of like a pearl almost. When there's sand in an oyster, they start to grow shell around the sand, and ends up creating the pearl. So it's similar process of protecting itself, and through that, the worm continues to kind of excrete feces or mud gets in there, and that's kind of how the blister starts to form.
Very good, thank you. And so next question from Hannah what are some of the main dangers to oysters in their natural habitat? So feel free to just pick 3 to 5. I know there's multiple to pick.
Yeah. So predation, and there's a lot of different organisms that like to eat oysters, like crabs. Another possible threat is what's termed sedimentation. So they can get buried by sediment from land, and also humans like to harvest oysters. So we also are in a way predators of oysters. Yeah, and so those are like the 3 main that I can kind of think of off the top of my head. Also, this mud blister worm, it's not necessarily, there's not a lot of mortality, like not a lot of, oyster death because of the worm, but they don't grow as large, and they're not as healthy when they're infested.
Right, fantastic. And that's very important for commercial growers who need to have oysters reach a certain size, correct?
Yeah.
Okay, let's see. I've got lots of questions coming in, so I'm trying to scan through here. And so great question from Sydney. When the shell has been infected by this invasive, Like, so I guess is the shell's nutrients lesser? So I'm wondering if, so the things that are coming from the shell, I guess when the shell's breaking down, right? So I guess the question Sydney's asking is, does the mud blister worm impact like the nutrients that are coming from the shell?
I wouldn't think so, because the oyster is still using the same kind of calcium carbonate, the same minerals to build its shell. So I don't think that the mud blister worm affects any of the nutrients that might get supplied to something like the redwoods.
Totally fair. I think so. And so this is a question from Emma about the lobster experiments that you were participating in earlier in your career. So why were those lobster experiments important? So what was maybe the goal of those experiments?
Yeah. So spiny lobster in the Caribbean is a really important species commercially. A lot of people like to eat lobsters. And so we were looking at environmental effects on the behavior of these lobsters, which can really help the commercial industry for future success.
Very good. And one more question, if you don't mind me asking, what would be, of the experiences that you have had leading up to where you are now, what would be something that was most impactful to you? Or maybe just what is something that you did that these participants may be like, oh, maybe I should keep my eye out for something like that, because that would really help me get to a place where you are today?
Yeah, I think as a kid volunteering for those oyster restoration programs, I also volunteered at a local aquarium, and that really sparked my interest in marine science and gave me kind of some background knowledge before going into the university. So if you have any volunteer opportunities in your area, I think that's a great way to kind of get some experiences and see if it's something that you're interested in.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Megan.
Yeah.